10 minutes.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. I welcome the fact that we are discussing this legislation. There's no doubt that the butchering of the 1997 Act by Fianna Fáil was absolutely and utterly reprehensible, and it was somewhat amusing to listen to their contribution earlier in that context. But that said, the idea that the Minister has moulded himself into some great liberator and defender of democracy, going boldly where nobody else ever has, is really stretching it a bit and doesn't stand up to any serious examination. I note from the launch of the bill last week, in his press statement, he said that the legislation strongly complements the substantial progress made on a suite of significant government reform measures which achieve greater openness, transparency, accountability and strengthen public governance and good governance across the system. Now, people could have been amazed reading that, going, what is he talking about and where is this openness and transparency? And he then goes on to tell us where it is, and I think there are a few pretty unfortunate examples, to be honest with you, because he starts off by talking about the Oireachtas Inquiries Bill in relation to the banking sector, which obviously already problems have emerged with in terms of the talk of the exclusion of Anglo, the exclusion of much evidence, and people who would have an authority in these matters saying that an Oireachtas inquiry will not get to the bottom of what went on there. He goes on to cite the whistleblower legislation which has been published. Again, whistleblowers is a bit of an unfortunate example, because the treatment and the most prominent whistleblowers in this state of recent years have obviously been the two Garda whistleblowers in relation to the penalty points examples. And, you know, they are a very bad example, if you like, of proving that transparency and openness is not alive and well under this government, particularly in the way in which they have been treated by the Minister for Justice and the Garda Commissioner, because these people who had information, who wanted to have an open and transparent society, used the mechanisms. They went to the confidential recipient, the information was brought to the Minister, they went to the Public Accounts Committee, to Controller and Auditor General, to members of the Oireachtas, to members of the Road Safety Authority. They shouldn't have had to go to any of those organisations, but in any case, their efforts resulted in the fact that the scandal of termination of penalty points was unearthed. They were proved accurate in that sense, and the loss of revenue to the state and the loss of credibility to the system has been exposed. But the only people who have suffered for that are the people who blew the whistle. So if that's the openness and transparency that we're talking about, and we're putting this bill in the context of, then it really falls short of what is possible and what is necessary. And I think when we're discussing it, we have to start with the absolute right to information, in my opinion. The only information which should be withheld is information which relates to an individual's privacy. Really, nothing else counts. Obviously, in some instances, you could say the security of the state, but I think in an Irish context, really, that really doesn't count for much. And if we were adhering to our role as a neutral country, it would matter even less. And we have a peculiar situation in Ireland where most people get their information from the media. And the media have an incredibly cavalier approach to dealing with people's individual privacy. They've no problem in invading that every day of the week in circumstances and with information that is of no relevance to the public whatsoever. But that same media have no appetite whatsoever to unearth and uncover information that actually would be in the public good. The days of investigative journalism, if you like, have been sadly diminished, and we've had the classic example of an investigative journalist who does do that job and ends up being forcibly made redundant in the case of Gemma O'Doherty from independent newspapers. And this is a reflection of the fact that the media is owned by a small number of private individuals who carry enormous political sway, and who the government, if you like, who lack calling the government to account. But I'm not surprised that they do, given the bailouts that independent news and media have got, and so on. So in that context of the privatisation of media information, then the state's handling of public information is even more important, because it is the people's information. And I agree with Deputy Wallace. We had the privilege of meeting Julian Assange in the summer, and that And what WikiLeaks have done shows the power of information, because information released by WikiLeaks in relation to corruption and deals behind the scenes in Iceland between the politicians and the banking basically led to Icelandic people coming out on the streets and preventing a scenario that we ended up enduring here of bailing out our banks, and they're much better off as a result of it. So information is good, and if people are doing their job properly, they should have no problem with that being unearthed. But the problem with this bill is exactly as Deputy Wallace has outlined, that the whole bill throughout its entirety gives the Minister massive powers to exempt organisations from disclosure, to exempt documents. Other sections are built, well, you don't have to give information if it's a bit too much work for you, if it's a little bit tedious, if you have to analyse the information. No, you don't have to do that either. You don't have to disclose the liabilities of state or public bodies, and so on and so on. The whole bill actually is based with curtailing information and excuses in that regard, and I think already we have a climate where it's very difficult. It is good that the fees are being reduced, but all of the same methods which have been used to prevent people from getting information are alive and well in the Minister's proposal in this new legislation. I have had residents who've spent years and probably hundreds of euros. They've been asked for thousands in instances from the local authority, Fingal County Council, in this regard to find documents relating to the planning of their homes which have been proved to be a fire safety hazard, and from a developer who has been engaged in such practices in other jurisdictions as well. And the idea that somebody would have to pay all that money and be met with the response, no, we can't do all that work, or we can't unearth those documents, or if you really want them, it's going to cost you a couple of grand, is completely unacceptable. And I don't think that this bill breaks from that spirit. I think in actual fact it enshrines that type of mentality which curtails information rather than frees it up. I think there are a number of other weakening measures in the bill which are not to be welcomed. The current position in the present bill requires bodies to maintain an index of any precedents, and that is quite important, because what that does is it empowers the public to access these precedents and to ensure then that the decisions that are being made, that are being arrived at, are being done in a fair and impartial manner, that like cases are being treated consistently, and so on, the very essence, if you like, of freedom of information. But this bill curtails that. It extinguishes the right that record of precedence would be held, and I think, if you like, that really goes against the grain of what freedom of information should be, and unmasks the government's intentions in that regard, because if people don't know whether they're being treated in an equal fashion, how are they going to get the documentary evidence then, which they can get presently? Under this new legislation, they'll have to go before the courts and seek discovery. And what citizen has that against the backdrop of austerity? Which brings me to a really important exempted area from this legislation, which is, of course, the courts themselves. Now, I cannot credit why the courts would be excluded from this process, unless, of course, you're dealing with sensitive family law in-camera cases. Anything else like that should be open to the public. Now, this is an enormous area which is in the spotlight already because of the backlog in appeals with the Supreme Court. But questions have been raised by some citizens. Well, why do we have such a volume of appeals going on? Is it maybe that the work being done in the lower courts and the judgments being made aren't really the best of judgments, and people are looking for more appeals in that regard, that there's a lack of proper information and dealing with these areas? And that is a hugely important area. And if you look at the fact that this state spent 16 million euros on a digital audio recording system for our courts, which have been in place in the Supreme Court since 2005, in the High Court since 2009, and the District Court since 2011, but we don't use them, and we don't give people access to that information, which could validly record what actually went on in the court, undo a lot of the mistakes which ultimately lead to appeals being had. So if we have, and we accepted, and the state invested in a digital recording scheme of what went on in the courts, well, presumably then surely all court documents and information relating to the courts should be open to the public as well. I think if we were serious about that, then we would be looking at these areas. I think the other area which has been left in a little bit of a loophole as a result of the way in which the Minister has formulated the legislation is the fact that for the new organisations which have been added on, the Central Bank and the Gardaí, that it's only records since 2008 which will be obtainable. And obviously, I suppose the justification is, they didn't know that they'd have to do them, so it's a bit hard for them to go back any further. I don't really accept that. We have a problem now. What about all the records from the 70s, the 80s and the 90s and so on? Obviously, under the 30-year rule, some government records do become available, but we're going to have to wait now, really, for all the documents between 1984 and 1998, which were very interesting years, are effectively going to remain secret. And there was no need for this. We could have included them in this legislation, and I think at a committee stage that should be done.
So just Deputy, you have less than 2 minutes to allow.
I'm going to finish now, Cathaoirleach. I think a radical overhaul of the freedom of information system is absolutely necessary and would have been very, very welcome. But that isn't what this is, unfortunately. It is putting a little sticking plaster on some of the butchery conducted in this area by Fianna Fáil. It doesn't restore it into being a best practice freedom of information bill that a civilised society would be proud of. And you see, every public body and every citizen, if they're doing their job properly, if they're prepared to be accountable, as long as you respect individual privacy, then information is a good thing. Information is empowering, and information belongs to the people. It shouldn't be the diktat of individuals, be they ministers or senior civil servants, to say, no, you, lesser person, are not entitled to know that. An educated population and informed people is the best way to govern, and is the only way in which we can really talk about reform. And based on the legislation as it's framed now, based on the lack of success in the opposition being able to get the government to take on board amendments that we would table, I think based on that it is a missed opportunity as well.